Good day, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's episode of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. In 1985, the organization known today as GLAAD was formed in New York in response to what its founders saw as defamatory coverage of the gay and lesbian community, and in particular, the sensationalized coverage of the early AIDS epidemic. While GLAAD continues its original mission of advocating for accurate and fair representation of the LGBTQ community in media and entertainment, under the leadership of my guest today, it has become so much more, leading the conversation, shaping the media narrative, changing the culture. Given that we're a couple of weeks away from the start of Pride Month 2024, and the 35th Annual GLAAD Media Awards were held just this past weekend, it's a good moment to sit down with my guests today. Sarah Kate Ellis is the president and CEO of GLAAD, positions she's held since 2014. Fittingly, Sarah Kate's professional life started in media, notably at Condé Nast and other publishing companies, but her activism goes back to student days. Widely recognized for her leadership in evolving GLAAD from media watchdog to cultural change agent, Sarah Kate was named to the 2023 Time 100, Time's annual list of the 100 most influential people in the world. Sarah Kate appears today thanks to the efforts of my colleague and GLAAD Executive Committee member, Andrea Calise, and to the efforts of my second guest today, my longtime Teneo colleague, Faten Alqaseer. Faten is a senior managing director at the firm where she leads our DE&I and social issues advisory group and is a member of the ESG advisory group's leadership. Faten started her career in finance and is an entrepreneur herself, having co-founded an ed tech startup in Bahrain. So Sarah Kate and Faten, thanks so much for joining me today and for being on the program for the first time. So, Sarah Kate, let me maybe start with you. Obviously, as I mentioned in the opening, Pride Month is about to begin, but 2024 feels so different in so many ways, not just because we're in a presidential election year, but there's a lot of cultural polarization in this country, obviously. So maybe tell us how things are different politically, socially, and in this election year, and what's at stake, and how GLAAD is preparing and advising on that front.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to be with you. We've done some work together. This is a different year. You nailed that. I think that we've been seeing a growing anti-LGBTQ sentiment from a small minority of folks, but who are very loud. And if you look from a legislative perspective, over the past 4 years, we've seen now we're in a legislative session where we've seen over 500 anti-LGBTQ bills proposed just this year. Each year we've seen it grow, doubling even. And so these bills are really targeted towards the transgender community. The majority are. We're seeing a new day of book bans, banning drag shows. So we're seeing a lot of anti-LGBTQ actions against our community. We report and track violence against our community, and we've seen an enormous uptick year over year in that as well. This last report that we did a while ago, back in the fall, was about 700 attacks on our community. So that's the framework for what we're walking into Pride. You mentioned it's an election year, and that, I think, our community has historically been used as a polarizing issue in elections and in politics. Even though we're not political, we've been politicized, right? And so, and by doing so, it puts us in a lot of danger. And so I think what we have seen, though, is over the years, just as we've seen those bills growing that are against us, we've seen corporate America growing for us. And I think that's been a really positive thing. We've seen an increase in representation. We just released our Where We Are on TV report, and we're continuing to see LGBTQ characters as part of storytelling. So there are a lot of great things that we're seeing, and I think because of our visibility growth as a community, we've seen this backlash to our community.
I want to come back later in the discussion to what's really driving a lot of this, but you did bring up one point I wanted to ask you about, which is, we refer to the LGBTQ community, but it is also made up of many sub-communities. And you were talking about this, for whatever reason, there's this particular focus right now on the transgender community. Why is that? Why does one subgroup or what have you all of a sudden come in the limelight? Or is there a catalyst, or is it just the latest thing?
I think it's visibility. 5 to 7 years ago, most Americans didn't even know the word transgender or someone who was transgender. Actually, I think it's about 7 years ago, 6% of the country said they knew someone who was transgender. Today, it's 30% of the country. And a lot of that is due to visibility. It's through storytelling, mostly through Hollywood and streaming. But what's happened is, because so many people, mind you, 70% of Americans don't know a transgender person.
Sure.
So they're learning about people who are transgender through the media. And oftentimes, as politicians now are villainizing trans people, that's how they're learning about them.
Now, considering that GLAAD, one of its core missions always has been the tracking of representation in media and entertainment and the like, when you see visibility of, say, the transgender community increasing, which in theory is a good thing, and more represented, say, in media and entertainment, do you then prepare for kind of the inevitable backlash? The visibility is rising, that's good. It's going to catalyze something coming back.
Yeah, I think yes is the answer. And in this time, though, the backlash has been so extreme because it's been a political backlash as well. And it really has taken center stage within some far extremists. And so that it's a little bit more dangerous than I've seen in the past, to be quite frank with you. And it is something that we try to prepare for, but you don't know where it's going to come and how it's going to come. And you don't know what their positioning is going to be all the time.
So Faten, let me bring you into the conversation here. So we're setting the stage. Talk a little bit about how everything that Sarah Kate just talked about is being manifest in the business community as you're seeing it, both with regards to LGBTQ issues in particular, but then also kind of zoom out and talk about the broader DE&I framework.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think it's that exact dynamic, right? But there are a lot of positive things happening, right? Over the past couple of years, companies have committed to better defining and better executing against priorities that bring in different perspectives, that enable people to succeed at work, that create more equitable processes. All of that really wonderful. There's greater disclosure, greater commitments, greater transparency, and therefore companies are seeing positive progress. On the other hand, there also is this loud minority, right? There's this segment of whether it's a small segment of shareholders or politicians, as you've indicated, who are actively fighting against some of these programs. And so one of the things that we've seen this year actually is an increasing number of companies putting into their 10K, into their disclosures to their investors, that DEI is a risk. It's a risk if you do too much, and it's a risk if you don't do enough. And so that's the environment that companies are navigating. I think when you think about the LGBTQ community, you can take a few steps back and look beyond DE&I at social issues more broadly. Over the past few years, CEOs and companies have realized they need to be more focused in prioritizing the topics they speak out about that are most relevant to their platform. So we're seeing more and more CEOs go deep on the topic. It's a topic that they identify with personally through their families, their lived experience. It's a topic that's important to their investors, to their customers. And so they're really doubling down. At the same time, we will see fewer rainbow flags on LinkedIn as companies are being a little more thoughtful about delivering against the strategies that they are committing to. So I think one of the things that we're working with a lot of companies on is how do you ensure that you're continuing to deliver for your employees and your customers and showing up for the LGBTQ community in a way that matters, and recognizing that there is this pushback in your investor base or in subsegments of your stakeholders, and how do you prepare for those as you look ahead?
So there's a number of things I'd love to unpack about what you just said. So, Sarah Kate, if you take what Faten just said about the corporate, I know you in your opening remarks, you talked about the environment seeming more dangerous now, but limiting our focus for the moment to the corporate sphere, what do you think? I mean, what should companies be kind of preparing for? In terms of boycotts, such as we saw with AB InBev and the Bud Light situation, or employee activism. Like, what are you when you're engaging with company managements? What are you saying? Hey, listen, these are the things you need to be thinking through, preparing for, having your communications in place, and how to mitigate the downside elements.
Yeah, well, I think you always want to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And so when I'm talking to companies and CEOs, what I'm hearing is a lot of what you're hearing, which is they're not walking away from the community at all. In fact, we've never had more partners from a corporate perspective. What they are doing, and you said so beautifully, is they're creating more thoughtful engagement that's more 365 days a year than focused on 1 month. For that 1 month, though, I do think what they want to be prepared for is what if somebody starts to push back at them? And we saw this last year, right? And you mentioned Bud Light and all of that. Most companies were pushed back against last year. The difference between those that became headlines and those that didn't were those that changed and shifted away from their perceived values, or what they said were their values. And so when I talk to any company, I say, make sure that your CMO is talking to your CEO and you're all talking to your lawyers, and that you're having these conversations and you know what you're going out with, and then stick with it, because your biggest liability is backing down from it.
Right. Backing down from it and not being aligned to the circle, the metaphorical wagons are circled properly.
Exactly.
You've got exposed holes then, right? So amongst the other risks, though, to prepare for, Faten, I think you kind of alluded to it, though, is shareholder activism as well. We've seen conservative groups asking shareholders to scrutinize LGBTQ themed marketing and PR campaigns, obviously. Some companies, I believe Target and perhaps Dell, are talking about actually putting those to a vote. Others have convinced the SEC that they don't need to. Verizon, I believe, and Walmart are included in that. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing on that front. And I guess the other question that inevitably brings to mind is, will any of these initiatives win? Or even if they don't win, are they having an effect on managements?
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic because, again, I know I sound like a broken record, but going back to it, there's the pro and the anti. Especially after 2020 with BLM and COVID, there was a significant increase in the use of shareholder proposals to drive forward on some of the D&I priorities. So we saw proposals around racial equity audits, equal pay, board diversity. Some of those were very successful at winning voter support. Others less so, but brought the topic to the boardroom and to the corporate kind of front of mind. Over the past couple of years, we've seen that tactic being deployed by the anti-D&I, the stakeholders who are against D&I strategies, who are unhappy with the way those strategies are being deployed, and specifically very much so against the LGBTQ community as well, weaponizing that tool. One thing to say is they are becoming smarter and smarter. They're becoming more specific. They are being more targeted. The actual support for when they go to a vote is very low single digits. Not seeing any of these really win the support to drive forward. But I think they're being successful in that they are drawing media attention. they're getting the limelight, which is what they're intended to do. And I expect that as soon as this tactic becomes a little old and stodgy, we won't see as many try to use this tool. But for now, it is really about bringing the conversation to the corporate forefront and media. And I know it's been front of mind with you all with Best Buy.
Yeah, we've been working specifically on this and educating corporates, because I think what happens, this is not my line of expertise, which is shareholder letters. However, I've become a little bit of a expert on it. And when these letters come in, the folks that receive them on the corporate side aren't necessarily, they put them through a process, right? But that process doesn't take into account that these are aggravated and that they are actually oftentimes full of lies. And so they're putting them through their paces to not have them go to a vote. And actually it kind of sometimes behooves them to go to a vote, because in that they're not getting 2% of the vote even. But what we're finding is that it's causing disruption in the company, right? And especially if people aren't, because of the folks that are dealing with it, they're not thinking of it from a comms perspective. So you really have to bring the team together. Similar to what I was saying about pride, just bring the team together, have a conversation about it, and you'll avoid a lot of pitfalls that way.
No, I completely agree. I think one of the things that's really interesting to see with this example is in the immediate aftermath, you also saw the comptroller of New York State step out and say, I'm concerned that this is going forward. Is this an indication that you're pulling back from the commitments that you have made that we as an investor are supportive of? So I think it's being thoughtful about those types of stakeholders, mapping out and understanding not just where you are today, but the commitments you have made to the corporation and who your stakeholders are and what they prioritize helps protect companies from misstepping and having to correct or being caught off by an instance like that.
I just want to add that it's so much on people who are trying to run a business today. And that's why you have us to help navigate that, right? Like that is what we think about all day, every day, whether it be pride or it be these shareholder letters. This is what we do all the time. So I encourage folks to call us and help, and we can help navigate this, because it's not hard, but it isn't something if you're not an expert and you don't understand.
Right. And before they make that call, or the thing that they're going to be thinking about before they make that call to you, of course, thus far we've been sort of talking in generalities, some things that are relevant to all companies. But I imagine tactically or even strategically, how you advise, it depends also to a degree on where companies operate, the industries they're in. If they are very, very, sort of consumer facing, we've talked about Target earlier and where they're putting pride-oriented merchandise on the store floors and in which stores today, versus, some industrial tooling company out in the middle of nowhere that no consumer actually ever faces, but still has members of the community working for them or buying from them or what have you. So how do you, is there really just one message, or do you really calibrate tactically with these different types of industries?
You have to calibrate. I mean, it really does matter. The audience, the size of store, the location of store. That Target, the recent Target story really has me a little annoyed, because I think that the media did a disservice on that one, because oftentimes no store has the exact same merchandise. Like that's ground zero. And then number two is what Target actually did was build out a larger 365-day program that is inclusive of LGBTQ folks. And so it was really focused on, their store real estate, and it didn't take into account all of the other things. And I was one of the, if not the most outspoken person about Target back in last June, because I didn't think that they handled it properly. But I will say that I think that it is precise, that it's surgical, the way that you have to approach these issues. And you have to have the team that wants to do it, right? And is courageous enough to do it. Cracker Barrel was last year, Nike was, North Face was. There's a lot of companies that were very courageous that didn't back down. And I think also when you take all of that into account, the way you deliver it is also really important. It's what you say, how you say it, and when you say it.
I know something that's been of great interest to you, or increasing focus of yours, has been on at the state level, in addition to what's going on nationally. And I wonder, too, on this front, because you've got a lot of companies that might be based in a state or in a city that is allied, that is friendly to the community, but clearly have got operations or locations or employees or what have you in places that are not. And company headquarters might not be as culturally attuned to those places. Like, how do you help them, maneuver through that minefield?
Yeah. Honestly, there isn't a person who is watching this that doesn't have a family member or a coworker who's LGBTQ. And so I think it's really important to point out in those moments that this is a marginalized community who's being politicized, and kind of ground people as to where we are as a community, because it all of a sudden becomes, well, we work out of here and we market to these folks, and it's just human beings. And so we kind of try and break it back down to, at the core level, what is happening. But we're surgical in our advice, because if the company gets it right, the company wins and we win too. The community wins. And so, yes, it does matter where you're located. It does matter what you're being attacked for. And it does matter how you respond. So all of that is taken into consideration. And I always say, we'll give you the advice. We'll game out if you take our advice. We'll game out if you don't take our advice. And that's you're running your own business, so you can take it from there.
With the eyes wide open about what,
yeah.
So Faten, I think you alluded to this earlier, but it seemed quite clear over the last year or two that a certain degree, I don't know what you want to call it, cause fatigue potentially was setting in at the ELT and board levels in some cases, and there was a lot of advice being given to companies that they seemed to be embracing in a way, which was that it is neither necessary nor probably desirable for the CEO to be out there on every single issue, political, social, otherwise. And it was almost inevitable that they were going to run into a buzzsaw eventually. And I think it came last fall. You and I have talked about this a lot on the Israel-Hamas situation as an example. But if we're going to be in a world where CEOs are not compelled to weigh in on every single issue, they are going to pick and choose depending on what's near and dear or critical to their industry and company, or what's very, very important to them personally. How do you advise on how to pick and choose the when and how they're going to do this? And I guess my follow-up question to that would be, if those issues are going to be more distributed amongst corporate America, to just be blunt about it, will LGBTQ get its fair share of that attention, in a sense, versus the other issues that are out there?
I think the first step is to separate between the issues that CEOs build a platform around and speak out about. That's one thing. The second area is what companies do, or what CEOs encourage and support their companies in doing around social issues, right? So a CEO may not talk about the LGBTQ community, celebrating different Women's History Month, et cetera, Black History Months, et cetera. They may not choose to take all of those moments to continuously come out and celebrate each community, but that doesn't mean that they're not continuing to make the investments to better engage employees who identify with those groups, to make sure that their benefits are there to support those groups, to look at the data, to understand, we have women at senior levels that are leaving the organization. What can we do to better retain that talent? So what we work with on kind of corporate strategy and policy to make sure that companies are supporting their stakeholders is separate and not being pulled back. To your point, where we're seeing more nuances, companies are realizing that from an airtime perspective, they have limited airtime, and CEOs have limited airtime, and they need to focus on the issues where they can have the most impact and are the most relevant. So I think that nuance is where we'll see greater impact from a fewer number on each of the issues, but will not, and we haven't seen it yet, mean a pullback from the actual programming.
I also think from a strategic perspective and a future proofing of your business, right? Yeah. When you look at this next generation in terms of attracting talent and attracting consumers, if you're a consumer facing company, is that, anywhere that you read, 20 to 40% of this generation identify as LGBTQ. 80% identify as allies. So to your question about will LGBTQ get squeezed out, I don't think they will. I don't think we will. I just the conversations that I have and the urgency and the understanding of who our community is and how it is growing, because visibility is growing and it's making it a somewhat safer society to come out in, is now becoming important for corporates. And the other thing is that, sometimes it sounds so strange to be talking about all these issues when you're talking about companies that are supposed to be running businesses, right? I mean, we're in a capitalist society, right? And so there's the employee part, there's the consumer part. And then I also think that there is this understanding that more employees trust their employers than trust the media or the government today. And so there's this new duty on CEOs in the past 5 years that we haven't, or 7 years, that we haven't seen before, as trust is eroding in other spaces and places. It's growing at the corporate level. And so I think that it's great and unfortunate all in the same way, but it's a bigger responsibility for the CEOs and the companies, and they have to tackle it.
So given that, are you finding when we are seeing instances where, say, companies are pulling back from a lot of the more, say, overt messaging, or to Faten's example, maybe you would see fewer Pride rainbows on the website during Pride Month this year or what have you? If employees feel like their managements and their employers have provided a safe and inclusive workspace and have been allies to the community and so on and so forth, that management has had the space to take some of these actions and not have the employees and other stakeholders feel like they were pulling back from their commitment, that the actions continue to speak louder than some of the details on the margin, let's say.
Right. And I think that's through communication within the organization. And I also think, I hear a lot about quiet diplomacy. And I think it's important that they're communicating that quiet diplomacy, meaning that they are still moving and advancing things forward. It's just not in the media and not in the press. It's not as visible because it's been so politicized. And because we are in an election year, you cannot remove that. And people are looking to attack companies in an election year and make that get their minute of fame, raise their money off of these moments.
I also think that there's, I've seen references and from experts in media that talk about, the number of references to DEI on investor calls has dropped. The number of references, that's a good thing, right? There are a lot of issues that CEOs and companies are navigating. DEI was a new priority in 2020, 21 for a lot of companies who didn't have strategies, not all of them, but for many of them. And so, of course, it was something they talked about in detail with their investors as they were laying out strategies and reassuring their investors about their approach to managing this opportunity or risk. That number going down is not a bad thing. So I think we're over-indexing on how much airtime topics are getting and less on the actual impact and commitment and policies that are in place.
And so Sarah Kate mentioned the importance of communication. Are you finding that companies are doing a good job of communicating to the stakeholders about why they are taking the actions that they are, and therefore maintaining that level of trust that they spent time and political capital building?
I think some companies are doing a fantastic job of it, and others are, we have some clients that's an area we're working with them on, and it's a big part of our work with clients is really to think about who are your key stakeholders, what are their perspectives on these issues, and how can you engage with them. So open channels of communications, clear messaging, transparency, all of that is at play and is something that some companies have a long history of on this topic. For others, they're clear on communicating around financial metrics, but they haven't really cracked the code when it comes to their people or their customers on topics like this. So,
Sarah Kate, going back to, we've been now talking about some very good positive trends coming out of corporate America, but at the outset, we talked about why this time is different. There is a lot of danger, there's a lot of risk, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of threats out there. You've talked about the political environment in an election year. Faten talked about the more, say, that opponents of the community are getting better, for lack of a better term, at their approach to this. They're becoming more targeted. They're becoming more surgical. They know what they're doing. But when you step away, are there other elements at work from your perspective here that are driving some of these risks and concerns that you? Is it, the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action on college admissions is reverberating throughout corporate America, obviously. But some of these things that we saw as sort of sacred, Roe v. Wade, and then the Dobbs decision comes down as an example. Is there more license, out there in a sense? And really, when you see somebody like Governor DeSantis take on one of the most significant employers in his own state, over the Don't Say Gay legislation and the like. What's going on here?
Yeah. Well, I think we're in a different age and a different time than we've ever seen before. And I do think that things that we thought were set have been unraveled in a pretty quick way, if you will. And I think that builds insecurity, especially for community. So from our perspective, there's no federal legislation that protects our community. We're protected by the Supreme Court, which doesn't make you feel very protected now. So they can roll back our marriages. The most employment protections that we have, because prior to several years ago, could be fired just for being LGBTQ at work. There is a piece of not legislation, but the Supreme Court did rule on that. And there's a patchwork at the state level of protections, but it's a patchwork and there's a lot of holes in it. And so I do think that the combination between people wanting to build their profile and use platforms to do that, and people at the expense of marginalized people, is something that's been growing in this country. And then on the other side of it is that when we see legislation or decisions be unraveled, it creates chaos and insecurity in a country. And so I do think that those factors are at play here.
What do you think on that? You and I have talked about this quite a bit, so.
I completely agree. Like I think that DE&I, like any other practice, is something that should continue to evolve. There should be, pushback on strategies that aren't working well, questions about how effective certain deployments are. But what we're seeing now is not a thoughtful dialogue around DE&I, right? DE&I includes things like policies against sexual harassment, parental leave, equal pay. We're seeing a lot of slogans: anti-DE&I, anti-woke, anti-LGBTQ, right? They're choosing the wedge issues and using those to draw a broad label across things that are significantly broader. And so, unfortunately, I think we're in a place where we're not having the most productive conversations as far as how to continue to evolve corporate America, social engagement, political issues, laws and policies. But hopefully, as part of this exercise, and some of these conversations, some of those nuggets are being captured and we're continuing to evolve in the right direction.
I think there's this belief or sentiment that there's only one piece of the pie and we all have to fight over that one piece, as opposed to there are many, many, many pies and we can all flourish. It doesn't mean that some have to fail for others to flourish. And there's that there's some strange sentiment around that happens in our culture and society. And I'm not a believer in it. I think all boats rise, but it does feel like an us and them when I don't know why it needs to feel that way ever.
Right.
I think that we are, as D&I practitioners, sometimes at fault. Some of the language that we have used, and I sort of use the label on D&I more broadly, focuses on what we are doing to serve certain communities or certain programs, and that message has gotten lost along the way, right? It's something that Kevin and I were talking about. It's about not about how to cut the pie into smaller pieces. How do we expand the size of the pie? How do we remove barriers so that more people can be successful at work, not so that someone else can take your job? That's not what we're going for here. So I think one of the things that we need to do a better job and help companies do a better job of is to draw that data that shows that these programs support people so that they can be successful at work, and it helps everyone. The share price goes up. Everyone benefits within the company and within society.
That raises a question, and I'd be interested to know what you think about this. I wonder, it feels like in this charged political moment that we are in, one of the things that demagogues are able to very, very successfully exploit is this notion that the white, straight male is under attack, right? The former president basically talking about reverse racism is worse than any racism ever was in the first place, and that is resonating in a way. But when you distill it down to individual conversations, sometimes there is this very us-them kind of conversation, not only from that community back into talking to the rest of the world, but sometimes even with different affinity groups in companies and the like, there is an us-them. I'm wondering do you feel that there is an unnecessary alienation of say, the white, straight, male cohort, such as it is out there, that actually could be very easily co-opted and made ally, but made to feel like the them? Is that an issue or not?
I think there's economic issues. I think we get down to people that feel that the system is broken and hasn't provided for them. And so they are, so I think that is a socioeconomic issue more than it is a white or a black or a issue, in that people feel left out and don't know how to create or how to sustain a family or pay for things. I think oftentimes a lot of this stuff comes down to economic issues. And what I want to say about that is that, within our own community, we have a lower rate of living at a socioeconomic lower rate because of the lack of access to jobs or education and all of that. And so I do think that I hate the us and them. I think that we've been politicized and polarized for some people's gain at the expense of all of us.
Right. So I want to pivot a little bit and talk a bit about GLAAD itself, if we could, for a second, because I mentioned at the outset the sort of the origin story in a way. And I remember back in the mid '80s when the organization was founded, and sort of the height of AIDS fear especially in this city and others. But it seemed like there was an early victory. Like in 1987, GLAAD convinced the New York Times to change the nomenclature and change the language that they use to talk about the community and the like. And that's got to be a huge win, because the New York Times sort of sets the standards journalistically, or at least it did at that time. Talk about the evolution of mission of GLAAD, and also, are there highly resonant, low-hanging fruit, kind of like the today equivalent of the New York Times in '87, that's out there that can be achieved?
Well, so I would say that when we started, it was really about holding media and journalism accountable. And at the same time, our founders realized that we were invisible. So they were telling our story. We weren't telling our own story. So we really started to lobby Hollywood to tell more stories that included LGBTQ folks in there. And what I've learned over time is that as media has evolved, our organization has evolved. Culture and influence really were one-way streets out of Manhattan news and journalism and Hollywood. And now it's everywhere. It's out of corner offices at CEOs suites. It's out of Silicon Valley. It's out of the Beltway, right? Because the cable news channels only cover the Beltway. And so what we do now is we make sure that we're at all of those places where culture is set and influence is. And that takes us to Davos every year, to the World Economic Forum, to make sure that while the masterminds of the world are creating the agenda for the year, that LGBTQ is at that table. It's why we worked with the Pope, too, because he has 2 billion people who follow him. And so for him to speak out about decriminalization globally, where it's still illegal in almost 70 countries to be LGBTQ, or to say that the Catholic Church should bless same-sex weddings or marriages, that has tremendous influence. So that's how we have evolved. We still hold the media accountable. And the New York Times, we actually have had a 15-month campaign trying to get them to do better around transgender people and reporting. And it has been met with a tremendous amount of silence. This is our third New York Times campaign. We had gay and homosexual, their AIDS, which was around their AIDS coverage. Then we lobbied them to include LGBT or gay, marriage equality in commitment ceremonies, to move from marriage to commitment before we could get married. And now we're working on trying to get them to do better covering transgender folks.
Why? Now, it might come as a surprise to say those who get their news from Fox News all day long think of the New York Times as the bastion of liberalism in this country. What's the rationale for silence and pushing back on? They just don't like to be told what to do, or is there something deeper?
We would love to know. I mean, I would really like to know. I think we've been at this now for nearly 15 months, and we can't get them to sit down with transgender people to talk to them, to understand how damaging their reporting is and what it's doing. From their perspective, they've said that they're showing two sides. Science is pretty, there usually isn't two sides to science. So that's where we've sort of hit some trouble with them. But we're still open to conversations. We'd love to have transgender people sit with them and talk to them and to understand the damage it's doing to the community.
Sorry, I was going to say that there's one other role that you all play that we haven't really touched on today, as far as GLAAD within the ecosystem of organization that supports the LGBTQ community. Obviously, there are a couple of big players like yours, but there aren't that many. You're one of the biggest. Can you talk a little bit about how do you develop those relationships and recognizing that there's so much going on around this country at a local level? How do you approach those partnerships?
So for us, we started as a watchdog, and we still do have that in our blood, right? And we're doing that in this latest campaign that we just talked about. But we've evolved into a partner. And see, when any of our partners win, we all win. They win, we win, and we really approach our work from that perspective. I also have 20 years of corporate experience behind me, which shows itself, I'm sure, in these conversations. So I think that is, we really approach challenges by how can everyone win here. A great example of that is, this is very old, but the Academy Awards, Kevin Hart was named as the head, he was going to be the host. He had said some really derogatory things about specifically gay men. And we asked him, we said, we don't want you to step down, we want you to step up. We want to hear you support the community. And you can change so many hearts and minds because of the influence and the communities that you reach. So that's how we try to partner with folks. That didn't work out in that case. He ended up stepping down and not speaking out. But we're always there to help and assist along the way.
So I wanted to ask one more question about GLAAD before moving on to the final subject. But for those who are familiar with GLAAD, they'll be super familiar with the reports that you put out. For those who aren't, GLAAD puts out extremely detailed reports about LGBTQ representation in film and media and television and the like, and the types of roles and so on and so forth. So what's the latest kind of report card on that with the, in the last year or so? And does the world that we're kind of seem to be further evolving to in the media and entertainment space and like, which is where everything is more and more niche. The algorithm tells you this is what you want to see. And, is therefore, are the messages and the representation breaking through if people want to just watch this kind of stuff over here, so to speak?
So we do over a dozen reports annually. And that's reports and research reports, and everything from voter polls to understand what is driving LGBTQ voters to the polls, to, like you said, where we are on TV is the name of the report. And we've been doing that for decades. When we started doing it, there were 12 LGBTQ characters on TV. Now there's over 350. There were about 450 last year. We saw a decline, but a lot of that had to do with the strike. We have been seeing a little bit of a pullback, but we're also seeing a consolidation of media at that level too, in terms of networks and streamers. So we're seeing that all happen at the same time. What we also do are reports on advertising, because that's the most pervasive storytelling in the world. Talk about algorithms and delivering specific messages to people. Number two is we do a report on the social media companies, the 5 big ones, because we need to hold them accountable for the safety that they do or don't provide on their platforms for our community. Our community has been the most weaponized on social media platforms, and we also are the strongest users of those platforms. And we just released our first video game report. That is the entertainment business that nobody's talking about. That's the biggest business in the world. Right. All of the studios and streamers together don't add up to the entertainment, to the video gaming business. It's enormous. And so now we're reporting on that. And so the idea is that when we can set the stakes and set the table, then people can do better. And what we do is we provide those, like we were saying before, in partnership, and say, here's where you are, here's how you can do better, here's how we can help you do that.
I want to end by asking both of you a little bit about looking forward. You provided a statistic a little while ago about the Gen Z generation and the extraordinary percent of that generation that identifies as LGBTQ or as allies, and which would seem to be very, very encouraging on the one hand. But does experience tell you, should we straight line that? Or it always seems to me that the youngest generation or the newest adult generation is always sort of the most liberal and progressive and open, and then they kind of evolve as they get older. So I'm assuming you're not claiming victory by any means here, but what is that, how much positivity do you take from those kind of statistics, or how much skepticism do you have, or what does it tell you?
It tells me that we should be really positive and hopeful for the future. I find it to be very optimistic. And yes, they tend to be more liberal when they're younger, but I also think that they've grown up now with marriage equality. They've grown up with LGBTQ people of color in their lives. Like, it's different now. And oftentimes it's like watching a movie, like even watching 9 to 5, Dolly Parton's 9 to 5. versus like, how does that play today? That movie wouldn't be made today because the standards are different today, because we actually have to respect women in the workplace today. And we are moving toward pay equality in some industries. And so I think the overarching drive where we are progressing. The world has to progress. Otherwise, we're talking about regressing and going back to caveman days and dark ages. So even though we're living through a lot of hard times, it's these hard times that create, I think, the greatest movement forward.
And so Faten, Sarah Kate earlier used the term future-proofing, and so I'm wondering, I mean, on the one hand, we've got a phenomenal, say, demographic base that's being built, and you couple that then with corporate initiatives and the like. Is this a positive picture, even in the midst of this kind of depressing and chaotic political environment that we perhaps have?
I think so. I'm going to go back to what you said, Sarah Kate. I think there's so much positive that we can focus on. And yes, there is politicization, but I would separate politicization from the experience, right? The lived experience of people in this country and around the world is to see people who are different from them and to engage with them and to understand them in a way that they didn't before. And one of the things that we've learned from the corporate side is it is hard to put something back in the bottle once it's out, right? So the level of disclosure on the corporate side on these topics and the commitments that they've made and the policies that they've reported on, you're not going to be able to unwind that. And so yes, it'll be a bumpy ride. I always joke that after this year, I might need a sabbatical because it's just been such a tough time. But I do think that it's about figuring out the right policies and the right practices and helping folks along and partnering, like you said, with organizations. But I'm very positive on where we're going, as not just in this country, but around the world.
So Sarah Kate, I'm going to give you the last word here, and this is going to be the glass half full or the glass half empty question, I guess, is, given everything that we've just talked about over the last hour, I mean, do you see a world in which it's possible that a GLAAD is just no longer necessary? Or is there something kind of hardwired in societal DNA that unfortunately we're always going to need those to stand up for, people whose voices are not heard as powerfully as they ought to be in any variety of communities in this country?
That's a great question. I think I used to say that I want to put us out of business, and I do want to put us out of business. But then you look at Roe v. Wade, and I think, and that was 50 years. So I'm very careful to say that I would love to put ourselves out of business. I don't see that in the short term. But I dream of a world where it could be. And I think maybe this next generation could get us there because it is hardwired in them. And you can see it in the way they behave and the way they think about including people. And they're so thoughtful about how they engage in the world today.
Well, you said it earlier, hope for the best and prepare for the worst. Sarah Kate Ellis and Faten Alqaseer, thank you guys so much for being here today. We learned a lot. And just a reminder, Pride Month starts on June 1st. It's right around the corner. So I want to thank them both for joining us and thank you for joining us. Again, we'll be back with the next episode of Teneo Insights. And until then, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day.